Welcome back. Now that you have a good handle on controlled fertility, natural fertility, some of the terminology that we need to be thinking about how fertility varies from population to population, you're ready to explore some of these natural fertility populations and see how they differ and figure out what are the proximate determinants that their culture is essentially tinkering with to come up with to result in these different fertility rates. I'll take you first to meet a hunter-gatherer culture. Now, a few years back, my husband and I took our daughter to visit the Hadza. The Hadza people live in northern Tanzania. They have not adopted agriculture, but rather hunt for meat and gather plant materials for their subsistence. And you can see my little girl in bright pink, totally in culture shock and stuck like glue to her daddy while we watch them show us how to start a fire. Or she was glued to me, refusing to be put down when we got to hear the Hadza sing. Now, my daughter's reaction is the perfect example of how different people can seem from each other at first glance. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle feels so different from Western culture, the Western culture that we live in here in the United States. Remember when we talked about the tyranny of the present? The idea that the world as we experience it narrows our understanding of what past life was like? Well, that same concept applies to contemporary times too. When we look across different cultures, we all live in a culture, and that culture is essential to how we understand the way the world works. When we meet people who have a very different culture from our own, it can be uncomfortable and kind of scary. I mean, it's definitely disorienting. That discomfort, though, it leads people to be defensive, and they often assume that their way of doing things must be the right way, the best way to do something. I mean, it makes total sense to have that reaction, to struggle to get back to something that's familiar, where you know how things work, where you know what to say and you know how to react according to your cultural norms. It's really disconcerting to be out of your element. Now, for the next few slides, let me metaphorically hold you in my arms, like I did for my daughter, and introduce you to some very different ways of life. Remember, there is no one right way to be a human, and that cultural variation has been the key to our species' success. If there really was just one right way to successfully raise children and to support each other, we would have gone extinct many, many hundreds of thousands of years ago. We'll first meet another hunter-gatherer group, the Kunsan of Botswana. Botswana is a landlocked country just north of South Africa. The Kunsan live in the Kalahari Desert in central southern Africa. They form villages of 10 to 30 people. Their diet includes mostly roots, berries, fruits, and nuts. They do have some meat consumption from hunting, but meat is scarce, and it is shared communally among everyone. Everything is shared communally, and they move according to where resources are located. The mean fertility rate for the Kunsan is 4.6, and the standard deviation is 2.2. This means that the typical woman has 4 or 5 children, but this ranges quite a bit across individual women. So it's not uncommon to meet a woman in the Kunsan who has only had 2 children or who has had 7 children. And remember, they're not practicing birth control. They're in a state of natural fertility. For our next example, we visit a population in North America, the Amish. These are an Anabaptist Christian group who have large populations in Ohio and Pennsylvania. I went to graduate school at Penn State University, which is exactly in the middle of Pennsylvania. And to get there, you have to take many 2-lane roads when you drive. And so I learned quickly to be particularly mindful on these small, narrow roads, as it was not uncommon to quickly come upon a horse-drawn carriage. Now, the Amish, they restrict their use of modern technological devices, such as automobiles and electricity, believing that these technologies will challenge their traditions and result in a breakdown of community and family values. The Amish end their education at the 8th grade, and then they go to work on their farms and in manufacturing jobs. And the Amish, they deeply value humility and community. A typical Amish woman will have 6 children, and the variation around this is even greater than what we saw in the Kunsan, with a standard deviation of 3.3. So it is common then to meet a woman in the Amish community who has just 3 children and another who has 9. And again, a natural fertility population, they are not intending to have only 3 children or to have 9 children. Our third and last example that we will meet is another Anabaptist group, the Hutterites. Like the Amish, the Hutterites are part of the radical reformation of the Catholic Church that happened in the 16th century. This was when Protestant form of Christianity arose. Now, the Hutterites migrated to the Dakota Territory in Montana in the 1870s from Russia to avoid mandatory military service. They are pacifists, and they practice communal living. There's communal ownership of goods, and their meals are eaten in a common room. Many Hutterites actually moved to Canada after the U.S. military imprisoned 4 of them for refusing to serve in World War I. And 2 of them actually died from the torture. But remember, Hutterites are pacifists. The Hutterites also have the highest total fertility rate observed today, with an average TFR of 9.8. This means that women, on average, have 10 children. Now, in the last 125 years, their population has grown from 400 individuals to over 42,000 individuals. This is what such a high total fertility rate will accomplish. Let's revisit this graph now, where we were looking at the variation in the total fertility rate for controlled fertility populations and natural fertility populations. I have plotted on here in blue arrows the total fertility rate for 2 of the populations we were just looking at, the Kunsan and the Hutterites. So the Kunsan with their total fertility rate of 4.6 and the Hutterites with 9.8. So then one of the really big things between them, because remember they're both natural fertility populations, so the big difference between them is in their inner birth intervals. So we see that for the Kung, the inner birth interval, or the IBI, is 3 years, whereas for the Hutterites, it's 1.6 years. And this might not seem like that big of a difference just at first blush, until you really look at those numbers and over the course of that finite amount of time that a woman has in her for her reproductive life, and that it can have this dramatic effect in the size of the population and in the population growth of for that group of people. So the demographic impact of shorter and longer inner birth intervals can be tremendous. Now let's consider some different factors that influence that inner birth interval. Coming back to this figure that we were looking at before. Now you can see that the Hutterites are represented in that 4th bar from the top. So this hypothetical woman married in her early 20s and had children until she was in her early 40s. I don't have the Kunsan on this figure, but let's look at the hypothetical woman living in the Ganj culture. The Ganj are a small population of tribal horticulturalists living in the island of Papua New Guinea. They are not exclusive hunter-gatherers like the Kunsan, but they do not practice agriculture at the scale that we see for historical Europeans or for the Hutterites. Women in the Ganj population, they typically will marry in their early 20s too, like the Hutterites. The typical woman's reproductive life ends around age 40, like the Hutterites. But despite the similarities between the Hutterites and the Ganj, For the Ganj, the total fertility rate is 4 rather than 9. Now take a moment to look at the graph and see if you can identify the main differences. Now, for one, the waiting time to conception for the first birth is much longer for the Ganj, several years at least, whereas Hutterite women may become pregnant. A Hutterite woman may become pregnant within her first year of marriage. What else do you notice? Breastfeeding. Ganj women will nurse their babies for 3 or more years, and since they will carry their children with them, the frequency of suckling is quite high. And that means that prolactin levels stay elevated for this woman, and consequently, she remains in a state of lactational infecundability for much longer than the Hutterite woman. So what we are seeing here is how important variation in weaning is for that interbirth interval, and consequently, how important it is for the total fertility rate. Let's look at some trends, or let's consider what the trends are in these data. Because one question you may have, when we looked at the Hutterites, we looked at the Ganj, we looked at the Kunsan, is does the difference in subsistence pattern explain the variation? Well, when the researchers who were doing the study that I've been presenting here, when they looked at peasants, at tribal horticulturalists, at hunter-gatherers, they found that no, there was no significant interclass difference in the mean or the variance in total fertility, despite the fact that anecdotally that appears to be the case with those 3 or 4 populations that we were just considering. But when you look across those 140 populations, no. Subsistence pattern does not explain the variation. What we see is that 90% of the variation in all of those natural fertility population falls between 4 and 8. The interesting thing is that all populations with a total fertility rate greater than 8 can be considered colonizing populations. And so this means that when a culture moves into a new area, that they are exploiting, they are often having access to so many new resources that their fertility rates can be dramatically increased. They can dramatically reduce their interbirth intervals because of all of those resources, and therefore dramatically increase their total fertility rate. We also found that study of 140 populations and 70 natural fertility populations found that no populations with a total fertility rate lower than 8 could reasonably be classified as a colonizing population. So the act of colonizing new territory has dramatic demographic effects on the population that is doing the colonizing. And also, they found that populations with a total fertility rate around 4 have been found to actually have high levels of sexually transmitted diseases that result in premature sterility. So those populations that do have total fertility rates, those natural fertility populations that have a total fertility rate for women that are at 4 or lower, they have high rates of sexually transmitted diseases that dramatically decrease a woman's ability to get pregnant later in her reproductive years. So they see that in those populations, women will have their children earlier in their reproductive life and then have very few to no children in their later reproductive life as a result of these infections. And so with that, we move on to the next phase of our conversation, where we are going to, instead of looking at variation in fertility across living populations today, we are going to add some time depth to our investigation. We are going to look at how fertility has changed over the course of human evolution. So for that, proceed to the next video.